Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. About 100 and, nearly just over 200 years ago now, William Paley wrote a very famous book at the time called Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, collected from the appearances of nature. So this book, written back in 1802, Paley made a very strong argument for there being design in nature, and he attributed the designer as God. And he, however, pointed out that some of the design features included tooth and claw as part of this design. Now, this was essentially saying, well, that these animals that, like an eagle that has sharp beak and claws, these were all part of the original design, even though today an eagle would use these to sort of catch animals and kill them for food. Now, Darwin, who read Paley's book, realised that organisms have these design features that make them fit for the environment, and but also he recognised that they caused pain and death, and therefore he thought to himself, well, he had a problem with this, that if these were designed by God, how could a benevolent designer design something that caused pain and death? And he probably grappled with this, and like many others too, it leads some people to deny that God was the creator and designer, and whether or not there is a God. And this can lead them to think, well, maybe there wasn't, that God doesn't exist, or the God of the Bible that's supposed to be loving, how could he do this? And of course, one of the strong adherents to this view today is David Attenborough. Now, David Attenborough is a presenter of many amazing nature documentaries produced by the BBC in England, British Broadcasting Corporation. And he has used this argument that, okay, these animals, are designed to be very efficient killing machines, particularly cats. The big cats, even little cats, are very good at catching birds and killing animals, and the big cats as well, with their claws and teeth and the way they're designed and their digestive system. And matter of fact, Attenborough is quoted from an article that appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald quite a few years ago now, back in early 2000. Matter of fact, it was on page 6 of the guide in March 24, 2003. But Attenborough was quoted as saying this: when creationists talk about God creating every individual species as a separate act, they always instance hummingbirds or orchids, sunflowers and beautiful things. But Attenborough then goes on to say, I tend to think instead of the parasitic worm that is boring through the eye of a boy sitting on a bank of a river in West Africa, a worm that's going to make him blind. And then Attenborough challenges creationists. Are you telling me that the God you believe in, who you say is an all-merciful God who cares for each one of us individually, are you saying that God created this worm that can live in no other way than in an innocent child's eyeball? Because that doesn't seem to me to coincide with a God who's full of mercy. So that was Attenborough saying that then. And I think there are many people today that are using this argument to say that, this is evidence that, how can you say this about God? Well, there's a couple of things that come into play in this, and this is the fact that, as Genesis points out, as we learn in Genesis, there was the fall. And when we read in Genesis 3, verse 17, we see that God spoke to Adam And he said, because you have indeed heeded to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake, and all your toil, and in toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. And so it goes on, and so we know that there was this curse, and later on we have Paul writes that all creation groans. And so in Genesis 3:17 to 19, we read that the ground is cursed, and specifically there's this mention of thorns and thistles and pain and sorrow. And of course, I guess we aren't told all the full effects of the curse. But the thing that follows on is, if we read in verse 19, in the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you are shall return. So this is where we see death is brought in there. But one of the other things that is often overlooked is when we talk about these things, and that is that in verse 30 of Genesis chapter 1 here, we read, also to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so. So we can see that right back in the beginning, the main food was plants. Things didn't eat, animals. Now, one of the very important things to look here, and so I'm just reading a commentary on this. It says in verse 30, God explicitly states, also to every beast of the earth, to every bird in the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth in which there is life, I've given every green herb for food. Literally in the Hebrew, the phrase in which there is life is nefesh chayaya. This phrase is translated living soul and is used in Genesis chapter 1, 20 to 21. In Genesis 2:7, when referring to man and animals. However, this phrase is never used in reference to plants or invertebrate. And so when we think about this, the invertebrate would, for example, include bacteria. And so one of the questions I know, a friend of mine who was lecturing at a Christian college, she was challenged by one of the students in a biology class or a microbiology class, did Adam and Eve defecate? Because, that's sort of getting rid of, bacteria and a lot of dead bacteria. And so we assume that those natural processes took place. Also, the insects, which are invertebrate, multiply enormously, and they... And again, I've read other commentaries where these were considered as not having a soul, as to being more like little robots that do things. Now, I don't know. Obviously, it becomes a question that creationists, we don't have all the answers about these particular things, but it seems that back then the animals, like cats and lions and birds and these sort of things, these sort of animals, were originally, and the dinosaurs, they were all vegetarians. They were all plant-eating creatures, and probably just about everything ate plants. Now, and I was reading in one article where there have been instances where in zoos where they've run out of food, they've fed cats, for example, the big cats, lions and tigers, plant-based foods and fruit in particular, and they've survived quite well. So now there's a lot of things that we don't know, but the evidence is that the thorns and the thistles, these things were a result of sin. And also, if God caused then thorns and thistles, thorns to grow on the plants and spikes and this sort of thing at that time as the result of sin, then as a result of sin, maybe these other changes occurred in animals as well, so that, again, they could survive and control and preserve a balance in nature. The other thing that we observe in nature, of course, is a balance. There are ecosystems that all depend on each other. So initially we saw when God created the plants first, the plants are able to take ultraviolet light and use it to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, free the oxygen for animals to breathe, and produce the hydrogen ion that can be combined then with carbon dioxide to produce carbohydrates, which then become the sources of food and energy for animals down through the system that eat the plants. And so here we see there's an amazing ecosystem here, and many of the plants, they have flowers so that the flowers then can produce the seeds so that the plant can reproduce, and those flowers require pollination by insects. And so there's a whole ecosystem that is required, and the insects can live off the plants or the pollen and so forth. So there's an amazing system there. Now, at the present time, of course, there's been quite a lot of, just recently, a lot of people have spoken to me about viruses, and were viruses part of creation? And this, of course, raises an interesting question when we look at viruses. Now, we know, for example, and there's been a lot of talk in recent times about the microbiome, and we know now that the microbiome constitutes the thousands of different types of bacteria that colonise us. Of course, some people actually may only have hundreds of different types of bacteria, but generally it seems to be growing evidence that the greater variety of bacteria living in our digestive system, the healthier we're likely to be. And there are all different types of bacteria. Of course, we know that these bacteria actually now play a role in our health. Now, the other thing that we know is, of course, too, that we have a whole system of viruses that live inside us. We have a whole system of yeasts that live inside of us. And, of course, viruses are quite unique in themselves in that they're different from yeasts and bacteria, which are self-reproducing organisms that we would say are alive, in that they can multiply and reproduce, whereas viruses are essentially just a little piece of genetic code of DNA that is encapsulated in some protein, and it can enter a cell and switch on through parts of its code, become linked up with the DNA in the cell, and use that the mechanisms within the cell to reproduce itself. Now, these viruses actually play an important role in regulating bacteria, because bacteria double every 20 to 30 minutes or so. They double, they reproduce, they split off and produce another bacteria. So if there are so many bacteria around that over a long period of time, if they weren't held in check, they would just take over the world. And so viruses play an important role in keeping bacteria in check, because viruses can kill bacteria. These particular viruses that kill bacteria are called bacteriophages. and bacteriophages. And what happens is these viruses can enter the bacteria and cause it to split open and release its contents. Now, this can be very significant in terms of our nutrition, because we know that bacteria play a big role in helping us to digest some of the foods that we eat. As this food passes through us, the bacteria can process some of the food ingredients that haven't been processed earlier in the digestive system, and absorb minerals and other nutrients and produce in themselves vitamins and so forth. And then the bacteriophages can split open the bacteria, and these nutrients then become available for us to be absorbed. Plus, they seem to play an important role in controlling the levels of bacteria that we have in us. In other words, they maintain the balance in the ecosystem. So viruses have this, quite interesting role. There's been a lot of talk, of course, about the corona virus that is affecting people, or has affected a lot of people and caused a lot of deaths in the world. And this particular virus is one where normally a virus is, viruses can be coated with proteins, and this particular type of virus also has a fat layer around the outside. And often when you see pictures drawn of the corona CV19 virus, they show little spikes sticking out. Now, those little spikes are little proteins that are sticking out through the fat layer. And one of the interesting things about these type of viruses, and we're just learning more about these types of coronaviruses, like the SARS virus, for example. Some of the viruses have what we call virulence factors. And this is, they have little pieces of code that when they go into an organism, they actually suppress the organism's immune system and slow down the immune response. And that makes them particularly dangerous, because instead of, when this foreign body, this virus comes in, the body recognising, oh, this is something I need to defend against and destroy, instead that particular mechanism, or one of the mechanisms like interferon, is actually suppressed, and so that gives the virus a longer time to be in the organism. One of the other fascinating things is that while we've talked about these viruses play an important role in controlling the bacteria in the digestive system, and of course we have viruses on our skin and in many different places, that again there's this whole ecosystem between viruses and bacteria, is that different animals, of course, will have different ecosystems and different viruses that control the bacteria that are associated with their particular living system, and so it's not hurting them. And it's interesting that the viruses like HIV, which is supposed to come to humans from monkeys, a particular type of monkey, and again with the SARS virus, that was supposed to come from a particular bat, back when that was being studied there. It's interesting, and I find it very interesting if we read in Leviticus 11 that God told us that there were certain animals that were clean and other animals that were unclean. Now, the viruses that can be transmitted from one animal to, or from animals to humans, or from one animal to another animal are called zoonotic viruses, zoonotic, zoonotic. And these are the viruses that are most harmful because obviously they're now in a totally new environment, and our body may not have adapted to this, and that's why they can be, particularly harmful to us. And this is, again, some people say, well, were these created? Well, what can happen is we can have little pieces of pre-existing genetic code transferred across, and that then changes the characteristics. So it's not so much evolution of a totally new code, but a pre-existing code. And a classic example of this that maybe I can explain a little bit better would be in the case of food poisoning bacteria. So if we have, there are bacteria that live in us, and they're quite helpful to our health, but these particular bacteria, in order to be able to survive in us, they have to have acid resistance genes. Otherwise, when we eat them, when they get down into the acids to the stomach, they would be killed. So the acid in the stomach in that way is a protective mechanism that helps protect us against harmful bacteria. But if one of these really good bacteria that we normally eat part of food happens to get transferred to it from a toxic bacteria. So if we have a bacteria that's carrying the genes to produce a toxin, and under certain conditions that little pieces of the genetic material of that bacteria, that bad bacteria, can transfer into a good bacteria, that now good bacteria that would survive in us is now carrying the toxic genes, and it now becomes a food poisoning bacteria. So whereas our body would not have allowed the bacteria with the toxin to get in, it would have killed it, that because this other bacteria now has acid survival genes, it can now get into us and poison us. And so it's a similar scenario, and we see this again throughout the environment. I remember decades ago now, when the wood chip industry in Tasmania began expanding and sending wood chips to Japan for the paper manufacturer. The Japanese bulk carriers would come down in. They didn't have anything to bring down, so they carried water or water ballast. And as they filled up their ships up in Japan, so they were safe to travel out at sea, had more ballast, then when they got to Tasmania, they released the water from around Japan. Now, that water, unfortunately, carried some of the Japanese starfish. Now, the Japanese starfish was now in a new environment where there weren't the same predators, and it soon took over in Tasmania and essentially destroyed the scallop industry in Tasmania. I remember seeing photographs of, in the Derwent River and the entrance to the Dontracastro Channel, the floor of the ocean or the sea there was like a desert and was just covered with these starfish. And of course, once they'd eaten everything that was there to be eaten, they began eating themselves. And so this is a case, again, of something being out of its natural environment. And I think with it seems that the spread of particularly these nasty viruses that are affecting humans have come about through eating foods that God never intended us to eat. And I did hear one, I may have mentioned this before, did hear a physician, a Christian physician, saying that from his understanding that the biblical clean animals did not transfer harmful viruses to humans. And I think it's very interesting when we look at the Levitical laws there, and even the laws to wash too, and to wash food, and after handling a dead animal to wash our hands. It's again gives us evidence when you think that these instructions were written 3,500 years ago, as God gave them to Moses at the time as laws for his people to ensure that God's people had good health and strength. So were viruses created? Or as with all these things, it's hard to really know at creation. We know that it's highly likely that there were bacteria as part of our digestive system. And if there were bacteria, there were probably viruses that helped control the level of those bacteria, because the death of bacteria would not be included in the it was only the things that had the breath of life in them, so to speak, that were considered that didn't die at that time. So understanding the pre-fall ecosystem, we don't know exactly how it worked. And as I said, viruses in themselves aren't alive. They can't reproduce anyway. But after the fall, after man sinned, we know a whole lot of things changed. And only some of those curses are actually mentioned in the Bible. There would have been much greater number of changes that God had to make now that sin was there, and that included death. But of course, God didn't want Adam and Eve to die. But Adam and Eve had fallen for a trick by Satan where they'd accused God of being a liar. And of course now where God had said, if you eat the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will die. And of course, if God didn't let them die, then Satan could accuse God of being a liar. But God didn't want us to die. He really didn't want us to die. And so that's why God himself came as Jesus Christ and died in our place. And that means now that God is free to forgive us, but Satan can't accuse him of being a liar because God has paid the penalty in our place. And this is the fantastic good news of the gospel. And this is what needs to go to everybody out there as soon as possible, so that no matter what happens, they can have that assurance that one day they will be with God. And God is going to create this amazing new earth where there won't be any bad viruses and any bad things being killed and bad things happening. And that is something wonderful to look forward to. Remember too, you can listen to this program again or earlier programs by Googling 3ABN Australia, or one word, .org.au, and click on the listen button. You've been listening to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.